The dust, a choking shroud the color of dried blood, clung to Ilara's tattered skirts, each grain a testament to the miles she had run, a relentless pursuer in its own right. Her lungs burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, each breath a ragged saw tearing through her chest, but she could not stop, dared not stop, for the terror that nipped at her heels was a beast far more ravenous than the gnawing hunger in her belly or the raw, bleeding patches on her feet. Behind her lay the ruins of a life she hadn't chosen, a cage gilded with false promises and barred with brutal fists, orchestrated by Silas Blackwood, a man whose smile was a viper's warning and whose touch was a brand of shame. Ahead lay only the unforgiving expanse of the high plains, a canvas of desolation stretching towards a horizon that offered no solace, only more emptiness. She had heard whispers in the shadowed corners of Blackwood's establishment, tales of lone men carving out existence in these harsh lands, men as wild and untamed as the territory itself. Men who took what they wanted. Her heart, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs, fluttered with a dread so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. When her strength finally gave out, when her legs buckled and the unforgiving earth rose to meet her, it was before a crudely built cabin, smoke a thin, hesitant prayer rising from its stone chimney. A silhouette emerged, tall and broad against the dying sun, a figure seemingly carved from the very granite of the mountains that loomed in the distance. He moved with a quiet economy, his presence a silent thunder that vibrated through the parched ground. As he approached, Ilara could only curl into herself, a broken thing awaiting the final, inevitable blow. Her mind, fractured by exhaustion and fear, conjured images from Blackwood's cruel tutelage, the sting of the lash, the cold satisfaction in an abuser's eyes. She expected this stranger, this mountain of a man, to see her ruin, her worthlessness, and to enact the punishment she had come to believe was her due. She expected him to whip her, to reaffirm the brutal lessons life had seared into her soul. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her like a sentence. His face was weathered, carved with lines of hardship and some deeper, unreadable sorrow, his eyes the grey of a winter sky. He said nothing for a long moment, simply observed her with an unnerving stillness. Then, in a voice rough as unplaned timber, he spoke, not with anger, but with a weary practicality. "Water. You need water." He turned and went inside, leaving her trembling, not from the cold, but from a confusion that was almost as painful as her fear. He returned with a tin cup, and knelt, not menacingly, but with a strange, almost reluctant gentleness, offering it to her. The water was cool, life-giving, and as she drank, choking back sobs, a sliver of bewildered disbelief pierced through her terror. This was not the cruelty she had braced herself for. This was something else. Something her broken spirit could not yet name. He helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly steady, impersonal yet not unkind, and led her into the cabin. It was sparse, clean, the air smelling of wood smoke and solitude. He gestured to a rough-hewn bench. "Sit. Eat." He placed a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread before her, then retreated to the far side of the small room, his back to her, mending some piece of tack, granting her a privacy she hadn't known she craved. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her own ragged breathing, but it was not the suffocating silence of Blackwood's dominion. This was a silence of space, of emptiness, perhaps even of respect. She ate, her body screaming for sustenance, her mind reeling. Every instinct honed by years of abuse told her this was a prelude, a fattening before the slaughter. Yet, his continued distance, his lack of overt threat, began to sow tiny seeds of doubt in the barren ground of her expectations. When she had finished, he spoke again, without turning. "There's a cot in the lean-to. It's dry." He offered no explanation, no demand. Just a statement of fact. Ilara, armed with a lifetime of expecting the worst, could only nod, her throat too tight for words, and stumble towards the small, attached shed. It was little more than a space for storage, but it was shelter. As she lay on the thin mattress, the terror still a cold knot in her stomach, she replayed his actions. No raised voice. No leering gaze. No touch that lingered too long or sought to demean. The absence of expected cruelty was a bewildering torment in itself, leaving her adrift in an unknown sea. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Jedediah, for she had learned his name from a faded brand on a saddle, rose before dawn, his movements quiet, purposeful. He would leave food for her, bread, sometimes a piece of dried meat, or leftover stew, before heading out to work his small, struggling ranch. He rarely spoke to her directly, and when he did, his words were few, practical. "The well is there would need chopping, if you've a mind don't wander far." Coyote's Ilara, conditioned to earn her keep through abject submission, found herself at a loss. There were no orders, no threats to compel her. She began to help, tentatively at first, sweeping the cabin floor, mending his worn shirts with thread she found in a dusty box, tending the small fire. Each task was performed with a bated breath, expecting a reprimand for an imagined slight, a sharp word for her presumption. Instead, there was only Jedediah's continued, almost unnerving, quiet. He would return at dusk, smelling of earth and sweat, his face etched with fatigue. He would acknowledge her work with a curt nod, sometimes leaving a wild apple or a handful of berries on the table, offerings as silent and unadorned as the man himself. Her fear, though still a constant companion, began to shift. The immediate terror of violence lessened, replaced by a pervasive anxiety, a confusion about her place, her purpose. Was she a prisoner? A servant? Or something else entirely? One evening, a storm broke, the sky unleashing a torrent of rain and fury that seemed to mirror the turmoil within her. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the cabin's single window. Jedediah, caught out mending a fence line, returned soaked to the bone, his movements stiffer than usual. Without thinking, Ilara took the wet burlap sack he used as a coat and hung it near the fire, then ladled him a bowl of the thin soup she had managed to prepare. He looked at her then, a direct, searching gaze that made her breath catch. For a moment, she saw not just the stoic rancher, but a flicker of something raw, something akin to pain, in the depths of his grey eyes. He ate in silence, but the air between them felt different, charged with an unspoken current. Later that week, as she gathered eggs from the few scrawny chickens he kept, she saw him standing by two small, weathered wooden crosses on a slight rise behind the cabin. His hat was in his hands, his head bowed. The desolation in his posture was a heavier burden than any physical toil. She understood then, with a pang of shared sorrow, that his silence was not born of indifference, but of a grief so profound it had hollowed him out. That night, he broke their usual quiet. "The winters are hard here," he said, his voice raspy, staring into the fire. "A woman alone, it's no life. And this territory, it draws bad men." Ilara's heart pounded. She knew he spoke of men like Blackwood. "I need a wife," he stated, not looking at her. The words hung in the air, stark and unembellished. "Someone to share the work. To make this a home again. And a wife has protection under the law, such as it is." More than a strafe. Ilara stared at him, stunned. A wife? Was this another form of servitude, a more permanent cage? The word bride echoed strangely in her mind, so alien to her experience it felt like a foreign tongue. He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I won't lay a hand on you in anger. You'd have your own space. Food. Shelter. Safety. It's all I can offer, safety." The word resonated deep within her. Safety from Blackwood. Safety from the gnawing fear of the unknown. It wasn't a proposal of love, or even affection. It was a contract, a practical arrangement born of mutual desolation. She thought of the alternative, returning to the brutal life she'd fled, or perishing alone in the wilderness. The image of the whip, the symbol of her past torment, flashed in her mind, but it was contrasted now with the memory of his quiet grief by those small graves, his rough hands offering water, his gruff provision of shelter. He wasn't offering passion, but he wasn't offering pain either. He was offering a shield. I accept," she whispered, the words barely audible, her voice trembling not with fear this time, but with a fragile, terrifying hope. The circuit judge passed through the scattered settlements twice a year, a fleeting purveyor of legal sanction in a land that often made its own rules. Jedediah met him in the dusty, one-street town of Redemption Creek, a place that clung precariously to the edge of civilization. Ilara stood beside him, clad in a faded but clean calico dress she had painstakingly mended, her hands clasped tightly before her. The vows were brief, devoid of sentiment, a simple transaction witnessed by a curious storekeeper and his wife, Martha, a woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile that unsettled Ilara more than outright suspicion would have. Returning to the cabin, now legally bound, changed little and yet everything. The silence persisted, but it was laced with a new awareness, a subtle tension that was not entirely unpleasant. Ilara continued her chores, Jedediah his. She found a small patch of earth near the cabin and, using a rusty spade, began to cultivate a small garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. It was an act of faith, a whisper of permanence in their temporary arrangement. He watched her sometimes, from a distance, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, while mending a tear in one of his shirts, she pricked her finger. A small droplet of blood welled, and before she could stop it, a tear tracked down her cheek, not from the pain of the needle, but from the sudden, overwhelming wave of all she had endured. Jedediah, entering unheard, paused. He didn't speak, but he gently took the shirt from her trembling hands, his calloused fingers brushing hers. He then retrieved a small, carved wooden box from a high shelf up a box she had noticed but never dared investigate. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a woman's silver thimble and a tiny, intricately stitched sampler bearing the names Sarah and Little Ben. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with unshed tears. My wife. Sarah. And our boy. Fever took them. 5 years gone. He traced the embroidered names with a rough finger. This cabin, it was their dream. Ilara's heart ached with a profound empathy. His grief was a vast, silent wilderness, much like the land around them. She reached out, her hand covering his. I'm sorry, Jedediah, she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name so directly, so softly. He looked at her then, his eyes raw, vulnerable, seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a burden or a convenience, but as another soul marked by sorrow. The fragile bridge of shared grief spanned the chasm of their solitude. That evening, news drifted in from Redemption Creek, carried by a passing trapper. Men matching the description of Silas Blackwood and his enforcers had been seen asking questions, their inquiries pointed, their manner threatening. They were looking for a runaway woman. A cold dread seeped into Ilara. The past, it seemed, had long claws. Jedediah heard the news with a grim tightening of his jaw. He looked at Ilara, his gaze steady, protective. He won't take you, he said, the words a quiet vow. This is your home now. The wary community of Redemption Creek had initially kept its distance, their curiosity tinged with suspicion. A lone woman appearing out of nowhere, shacking up with the reclusive Jedediah Stone, it was fodder for gossip. But Martha, the storekeeper's wife, had seen something in Ilara's haunted eyes, a resilience that resonated with her own pioneering spirit. She began to offer small kindnesses, a bit of extra flour, a friendly word when Ilara ventured into town for supplies. Now, with the shadow of Blackwood looming, Jedediah felt the weight of his promise, the true meaning of the vows they had spoken. He was no longer just a grieving widower offering shelter, he was a husband, bound to protect. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. A late afternoon, the sun casting long, ominous shadows, Blackwood and 2 of his thugs rode into Jedediah's yard. Silas Blackwood was exactly as Ilara remembered, impeccably dressed despite the trail dust, his handsome face a mask for a cruel, possessive nature. His eyes, cold and assessing, fixed on Ilara as she stepped from the cabin, Jedediah moving to stand slightly in front of her. Ilara, my dear, Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, yet carrying an unmistakable menace. Such a foolish girl, running off like that. Did you truly think you could hide from me? He dismounted, his thugs remaining on horseback, their hands resting near their holstered guns. I've come to take you home. Jedediah's voice was low, steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. She is home. She's my wife, Blackwood laughed, a harsh, contemptuous sound. Wife? This chit? Don't be absurd, farmer. She belongs to me. I have papers, debts she owes. He took a step forward, his gaze flicking dismissively over Jedediah. Step aside. "This doesn't concern you, it concerns me," Jedediah repeated, unmoving, his stance rooted as an ancient oak. His hand drifted almost casually towards the hunting rifle propped against the cabin wall. "She's Mrs. Stone. And you'll address her as such. Now, you and your men will leave my property." The Blackwood's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You dare defy me? For her?" He sneered, his voice dripping venom. "She's nothing." A used, broken toy. Elara flinched, the familiar shame washing over her, but then she felt Jedediah's presence, solid and unwavering beside her. She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the grim determination in his eyes. He was not a man of many words, but his action spoke with an undeniable clarity. He was choosing to stand for her, to shield her, when no one else ever had. A spark of defiance, long dormant, ignited within her. "I am not yours, Silas," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I will not go back." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged for her, but Jedediah moved with surprising speed, intercepting him, shoving him back. One of Blackwood's thugs reached for his gun, but Jedediah's rifle was suddenly in his hands, leveled. "I suggest you reconsider," Jedediah said, his voice deadly calm. The air crackled with tension. The thugs exchanged uneasy glances. They were bullies, used to preying on the weak, not confronting a man whose eyes promised a fight to the death. Blackwood, incensed but not stupid, saw the deadly resolve in Jedediah's stance. He also saw, perhaps for the first time, the steel in Elara's spine. She was no longer the cowering creature he had tormented. "You'll regret this, farmer," Blackwood snarled, backing away. "Both of you." He remounted, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over." He wheeled his horse and, with his men, galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent threats hanging in the air. Elara sagged against the cabin wall, her legs weak with relief and the aftermath of terror. Jedediah lowered the rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly, the tension slowly ebbing from his powerful frame. He turned to her, his grey eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face, tears not of fear this time, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had stood for her. He had called her his wife, not as a legal fiction, but as a declaration. In that moment, the pragmatic arrangement they had made transformed into something more, something real and deeply felt. The wary community, whose whispers had reached even their isolated cabin, soon heard of the confrontation. Martha, in particular, spread the tale with a certain relish, emphasizing Jedediah's courage and Elara's quiet defiance. The tide of opinion began to turn, respect dawning for the unlikely couple who had faced down a tyrant. In the quiet aftermath of Blackwood's departure, a new landscape of emotion began to unfold between Elara and Jedediah. The shared danger had forged a bond stronger than any legal document, a connection tempered in the fires of adversity. The silence in the cabin was no longer one of mere cohabitation, but of comfortable companionship, punctuated by tentative conversations that slowly, carefully, began to bridge the gaps of their past sorrows. Elara found herself speaking of the darkness she had endured, not in detail, but of the weight of shame and fear she had carried. Jedediah listened, his gaze steady, his silence no longer one of emotional distance but of deep, empathetic understanding. He, in turn, spoke more of Sarah and little Ben, of the laughter that had once filled the cabin, of the dreams that had died with them. He showed her the small wooden toys he had carved for his son, the worn book of poetry Sarah had loved. In sharing their grief, they found not more sadness, but a mutual solace, a lightening of their individual burdens. The small garden Elara had planted began to thrive, a vibrant splash of green against the muted tones of the prairie. It became a symbol of their nascent hope, a testament to the possibility of growth even in the harshest conditions. Jedediah would often find her there, her hands in the soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a look of quiet contentment on her face that softened the lingering shadows in her eyes. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable quiet settled between them. Elara was mending one of Jedediah's shirts, her stitches neat and even. He watched her, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face, illuminating the strength and resilience that had blossomed within her. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers, stilling her needle. "Elara," he began, his voice deeper, softer than she had ever heard it. "The vows we spoke, they were for protection." For convenience he paused, his gaze earnest. "But you are more than that to me. This place, you've made it a home again. You've brought light back into it." Into me, her breath caught. His words, so simple, so direct, held a universe of meaning. "And you, Jedediah," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "you showed me what honor means. What true strength is. You gave me safety when all I knew was fear." He gently lifted her hand to his lips, his touch reverent. It was not the touch of a master, nor even just a protector, but of a man who cherished her. That night, the space between their cots, which had always seemed a vast, unbridgeable gulf, vanished. They came together not in a desperate clinging, but in a tender exploration, a culmination of the trust and affection that had slowly, surely grown between them. The harsh frontier that had once seemed a place of desolation now held the promise of a shared future. The cabin, once a mere shelter, became a true home, filled with the quiet rhythms of their life together, shared meals, whispered confidences, the comforting presence of another heartbeat in the vast solitude. Years passed. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Children's laughter eventually echoed where once only sorrow had resided, their own little Bens and Sarahs filling the cabin with new life, new dreams. Elara, no longer the frightened outcast, became a respected woman in Redemption Creek, known for her quiet grace and her flourishing garden. Jedediah, the wounded protector, found his heart healed, his purpose renewed in the love of his unlikely bride and the family they had built. The memory of her initial terror, the expectation of cruelty when she first collapsed at his doorstep, became a distant echo, a stark reminder of how far they had come. For in the heart of the unforgiving frontier, where she expected the lash of a whip, she had instead found the unwavering strength of a good man's arm, the profound shelter of his heart, and in his unexpected offer, not a new bondage, but the truest kind of freedom, the freedom to love and be loved in return. Their story became a quiet legend in those parts, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope can take root, and love, in its most unexpected forms, can redeem and rebuild, forging an unbreakable bond against the odds. What hardship, one might wonder, is too great to overcome when met with courage and an open heart? Perhaps the answer lies not in the avoidance of suffering, but in the finding of another soul willing to stand with you in the storm, turning a desolate wilderness into a shared sanctuary.